You people always try this scam. Captain Derek Hansen towers over Dr. Amara Richardson, his white uniform gleaming under the cabin lights. He points toward the back of the plane like he's shooing away a pest. Economy. Now. The entire first-class cabin falls silent. Passengers crane their necks to watch. But Amara doesn't move. She calmly reaches into her jacket and produces a federal identification badge. Hansen's eyes narrow with contempt. Nice try, lady. Anyone can buy these online. He snatches the badge from her hands. Click. His silver lighter flares to life. The federal credentials curl and blacken in the flames as passengers gasp and fumble for their phones. Amara watches her ID burn, completely motionless. Her voice cuts through the chaos, ice cold and certain. Congratulations, Captain. You just destroyed federal property and committed a felony. Hansen's smirk falters. Something in her tone makes his blood run cold. Have you ever seen someone's world collapse in real time? 3 hours earlier, Doctor. Amara Richardson had been reviewing classified briefing notes in her Washington, D.C. office. The nameplate on her mahogany desk read simply, Director. No need for anything more specific. Everyone who mattered knew exactly who she was. Her assistant knocked gently. Director Richardson, your car to Reagan National is ready. The congressional hearing tomorrow morning. I know, Amara replied, sliding the documents into her secure briefcase. Civil rights enforcement is about to get a lot more interesting. She had no idea how prophetic those words would be. At Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International, Amara moved through the terminal with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Her navy blazer was understated but expensive. Her briefcase bore the subtle seal that only federal employees would recognize. She'd learned long ago that projecting power was often about what you didn't show. At the gate, the blonde agent scrutinized Amara's first-class boarding pass for an unusually long time. This seems expensive for someone like you, the agent said, her voice dripping with false concern. Are you sure this isn't some kind of mistake? Maybe someone else's ticket? Amara's expression never changed. I'm quite sure. She'd dealt with this particular brand of skepticism her entire career. The assumption that a black woman couldn't possibly belong in spaces of power or privilege. It was exhausting, but it had also made her unshakable. Captain Derek Hansen was conducting his pre-flight walkthrough when Amara boarded. At 52, he carried himself like a man who'd never been questioned. 20 years of flying for Meridian Airlines had convinced him he was the ultimate authority on his aircraft. More importantly, he saw himself as a guardian of proper standards. Hansen prided himself on being able to spot trouble before it started. Drug dealers trying to flee jurisdiction, criminals using stolen credit cards for expensive tickets, people who didn't belong in first class. His eyes locked onto Amara immediately. She settled into seat 2A, pulling out a tablet loaded with federal case files. Her phone buzzed with a text from the Deputy Attorney General. Ready for tomorrow's testimony on airline discrimination patterns? She smiled grimly. The timing was almost cosmic. Hansen approached slowly, clipboard in hand. He'd perfected this routine over the years, official enough to seem legitimate, but personal enough to make his targets uncomfortable. Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Captain Hansen, just doing a quick verification of our first-class passengers today. He'd never done such verification with the elderly white businessman in 1A, or the young white woman in 3B chatting loudly on her phone about her family's vacation home. Amara looked up from her tablet. Is there a problem, Captain? Oh, no problem at all. It's just airline policy to verify documentation for certain passengers. I'm sure you understand. The words hung in the air like poison. Several nearby passengers had stopped their conversations to listen. The elderly businessman lowered his newspaper. The young woman paused her phone call. Amara reached into her jacket and produced her federal employee identification badge. The gold eagle gleamed under the cabin lights, but Hansen barely glanced at it. he said, his tone suggesting deep skepticism. Federal employee, huh? You know, we see a lot of fake badges these days. Anyone can order these things online for $20. I assure you, Captain, this badge is quite real. Well, let's just say I've learned to be cautious, especially with passengers who might be trying to, upgrade themselves improperly. The businessman in 1A shifted uncomfortably. This was getting awkward, but Hansen was just getting started. Tell you what, he continued, his voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Why don't you show me some additional identification? Something that proves you actually belong up here. Amara's fingers drummed once against her armrest. A tiny tell that most people would miss. But she'd learned patience in rooms where she was the only black face, the only woman, the only person under 60. This was just another Tuesday. Captain Hansen, she said quietly, I strongly advise you to reconsider this course of action. Something in her tone should have been a warning. The way she said his name like she was filing it away, the absolute certainty in her voice, the fact that she hadn't raised her voice or shown any anger at all. But Hansen heard only what he wanted to hear, a bluff from someone who'd been caught. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings. Security will escort you to your proper seat. He reached for his radio to call for backup. That's when Amara Richardson, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, decided she'd been patient long enough. Security to gate A7. We have a passenger situation that needs immediate attention. Hansen's voice crackled through his radio as he stared down at Amara with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd just solved a problem. Around them, the first-class cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger was now watching this unfold like a car crash in slow motion. The elderly businessman in 1A looked deeply uncomfortable. The young woman in 3B had stopped her phone call entirely, her mouth slightly open. A middle-aged couple across the aisle exchanged worried glances, but Hansen was in his element. This was his aircraft, his domain, his rules. Ma'am, I need you to stand up and gather your belongings. You'll be moved to an appropriate seat once security confirms your actual ticket status. Amara remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Captain Hansen, for the third time, I'm advising you to step back and reconsider. You're about to make a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your career. The only mistake here, Hansen announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, is someone thinking they can scam their way into first class with fake federal credentials. He held up her badge like it was evidence in a trial. Look at this thing. Probably printed it at home. You can buy these templates online for $20. A few passengers murmured among themselves. Hansen was playing to his audience now, confident in his authority. I've been flying for 20 years, people. I've seen every trick in the book. Drug dealers fleeing jurisdiction with stolen credit cards. Identity thieves using fake government IDs. People who think they can talk their way into seats they can't afford. Amara's expression never changed, but something shifted in her posture. A subtle straightening that suggested coiled steel beneath silk. Captain, you're making accusations without evidence. I've shown you my federal identification. I've provided my boarding pass. What exactly do you think gives you the right to detain a passenger based on your personal suspicions? My right. Hansen's voice rose. This is my airplane. I am the final authority on who belongs where. And I'm telling you that people like you don't belong in first class. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers audibly gasped. The businessman in 1A actually winced. Even the flight attendants, who had been watching from the galley, looked horrified. But Hansen was beyond caring about optics. He'd committed now. In his mind, backing down would look weak. Furthermore, he continued, waving her badge in the air, I don't believe for 1 second that this is real federal identification. The government doesn't hire people like you for important positions. That's when Amara Richardson's famous patience finally reached its limit. Captain Hansen, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the entire cabin. You just made the most expensive assumption of your life. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Several passengers leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Hansen mistook her movement for compliance. Finally. Security should be here any minute to sort this out properly. Instead, Amara reached into her jacket again. This time, she pulled out a different piece of identification. Larger, more official, with a photo and federal seals that caught the cabin light. Since you've decided to make this a public spectacle, she said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of authority, let me show you exactly who you're dealing with. Hansen barely glanced at the new ID. His arrogance had reached peak momentum. Another fake, he scoffed. Lady, you've got a whole collection of these things, don't you? What's next gonna tell me you're the president? He snatched the identification from her hands, just as he had with the badge. You know what I think about fake federal IDs? Hansen announced to the cabin. I think they belong in the trash. That's when he made the decision that would end his career. Click. The silver lighter appeared in his hand like a magic trick. The flame danced for a moment, bright and hungry. Captain, don't you dare, Amara started. But Hansen was beyond listening. With theatrical flair, he held both pieces of identification over the flame. This is what happens to people who try to scam their way onto my aircraft with fake government credentials. The federal employee badge caught fire first, the plastic melting and curling as passengers gasped and reached for their phones. The larger identification followed, the official seals blackening as the flames consumed them. Hansen dropped the burning remnants into the aisle, grinding them under his heel for good measure. There, he said with satisfaction. Problem solved. The cabin erupted in chaos. Passengers were pulling out phones, recording, whispering frantically to each other. The flight attendants looked like they wanted to disappear into the galley. Someone in the economy was standing up, trying to see what was happening. But Amara Richardson stood in the center of it all like the eye of a hurricane. Calm, controlled, terrifying in her composure. Captain Derek Hansen, she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Badge number 4471. Meridian Airlines Flight 447, September 6th, 2025, approximately 2:47 p.m. Hansen blinked. Why was she memorizing details? You have just committed destruction of federal property, violation of civil rights under federal statute, and interference with a federal officer in the performance of her duties. Her duties? Hansen laughed. Lady, whatever fantasy you're living in, it's over. Security is going to escort you off this plane, and you can explain your fake ID scam to the airport police. That's when the first security officer appeared at the aircraft door. Officer Martinez had been working airport security for 8 years. He'd seen every kind of passenger dispute imaginable. Drunk travelers, medical emergencies, unruly passengers, documentation issues. But as he stepped onto the aircraft and saw the woman standing in first class, his entire demeanor changed. His eyes went wide. His hand instinctively moved toward his radio. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tone of shocked recognition. Director Richardson? The words hit the cabin like a bomb. Hansen's confident expression faltered for the first time. Director what now? Martinez was already removing his hat, his posture shifting to something approaching attention. Ma'am, we received a call about a passenger disturbance, but I had no idea. What can I do for you? Amara's voice remained perfectly level. Officer Martinez, Captain Hansen has just destroyed my federal identification credentials and made several statements that I believe constitute civil rights violations. I need you to document this incident and contact FBI headquarters immediately. FBI headquarters? Hansen's voice cracked slightly. What are you talking about? Martinez was already on his radio. Control, this is Martinez. I need immediate supervisory response to Gate A7. We have a situation involving Director Richardson. Director Richardson of what? Hansen demanded, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The second security officer, Thompson, appeared behind Martinez. His reaction was identical. Instant recognition, immediate deference, barely concealed panic. "Ma'am," Thompson said, "we are so sorry about this incident. How can we assist you?" Hansen looked back and forth between the security officers, confusion and the first hints of genuine fear creeping into his expression. "Will someone please tell me what the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Amara reached into her jacket one more time. When her hand emerged, it held a badge case that she opened with deliberate slowness. The gold shield caught the cabin lights. The words, "Federal Bureau of Investigation," gleamed in raised letters, and below that, in smaller text that Hansen had to squint to read, "Director." The blood drained from Hansen's face so quickly that passengers later said they thought he might faint. Officer Martinez's radio crackled to life. "All units, be advised. We have the FBI director on scene. Repeat, FBI director on scene. Supervisors respond immediately." Hansen's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Around him, passengers were recording everything, their phones capturing the exact moment a man's world collapsed. Amara Richardson, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, looked directly into Hansen's eyes. "Captain," she said quietly, "you just burned the credentials of the person responsible for investigating civil rights violations in the aviation industry." Hansen's legs almost gave out. "Now," Amara continued, "would you like to explain to me why you felt comfortable making those assumptions about who I am and where I belong?" The next 30 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of bureaucratic panic. Hansen stood frozen in the aisle, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The confident pilot who had burned federal credentials was rapidly being replaced by a man who understood he'd just stepped into a legal minefield. "Director Richardson," he stammered. There's been a misunderstanding. I was just following standard security protocols." Amara held up one hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Captain Hansen, I advise you to remain silent. Anything you say from this point forward will be documented and potentially used in federal proceedings." Officer Martinez was speaking rapidly into his radio. "Airport Command, we need immediate response from legal, TSA supervision, and airline management. Priority 1 incident involving federal law enforcement. Within minutes, the aircraft became ground zero for a small army of officials." TSA supervisors arrived first, followed by airport police supervisors, then airline management representatives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. The passengers were buzzing with excitement and confusion. Phone cameras were everywhere, capturing every moment. The businessman in 1A was already posting on social media. "Holy shit. Just watched an airline pilot burn an FBI director's badge. This is insane. #Meridian Airlines numbered FBI. The young woman in 3B had called her father, a lawyer. "Dad, you're not going to believe what I just witnessed. I think I just saw someone commit a federal crime." Within an hour, #Meridian Airlines was trending on Twitter. Flight attendant Sarah Carter approached cautiously. She'd been working for Meridian for 7 years and had witnessed Hansen's behavior toward passengers of color before. But she'd never seen anything like this. "Director Richardson," she said quietly, "on behalf of Meridian Airlines, I want to apologize for this incident. Is there anything we can do to make this right?" Amara's expression remained professional but firm. "Miss Carter, I appreciate your concern. However, this matter is now beyond what the airline can simply apologize for. Captain Hansen has violated federal law." Airport Police Supervisor Williams had arrived and was trying to manage the chaos. He'd pulled Hansen aside for questioning, but the pilot seemed incapable of coherent responses. "I don't understand," Hansen kept repeating. "She looked like... how was I supposed to know? Was I supposed to know what, Captain?" Williams asked. "That she was actually... that she really..." Hansen's voice trailed off as the magnitude of his assumptions became clear. Meanwhile, Meridian Airlines Corporate was experiencing its own meltdown. CEO Patricia Walsh received the call while in a board meeting in Atlanta. "Ma'am, we have a situation." Her assistant's voice was tight with panic. "One of our pilots just destroyed the FBI director's identification credentials on Flight 447. Walsh actually dropped her phone. When she picked it up, her first words were, "Get our legal team on the phone immediately and cancel all my meetings for next week." The airline's crisis management team was activated within minutes. Internal emails flew back and forth as executives tried to understand how a routine flight had become a federal incident. From patricia.walsh@meridianair.com to legal.team@meridianair.com. Subject: urgent. Federal law enforcement incident. Priority: critical. Team: we have a pilot who apparently burned FBI Director Richardson's credentials on Flight 447. Need immediate legal assessment and damage control strategy. This is not a drill. Back on the aircraft, FBI headquarters in Washington had been notified. Deputy Director James Morrison received the call and immediately understood the implications. "Director Richardson was what?" he asked his assistant. "Racially profiled and had her credentials destroyed by an airline pilot, sir. She's requesting immediate federal response." Morrison rubbed his temples. This was going to be a long day. "Activate our Civil Rights Division and get me the Attorney General on the phone." Within 2 hours, the incident had reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The Attorney General's office issued a statement. "The FBI is investigating an incident involving discrimination against Director Richardson. We take civil rights violations seriously, especially when they involve federal law enforcement personnel." Hansen, meanwhile, was discovering that his union representative couldn't help him with federal crimes. "Derek," his union rep Mike Torres said over the phone, "I can defend you against airline discipline, but if the FBI wants to press federal charges for destroying government property, that's way beyond what I can handle. You need a criminal defense attorney." The pilots' union issued their own statement distancing themselves from Hansen's actions. The Allied Pilots Association does not condone discrimination in any form. Captain Hansen's actions do not represent the values of our membership. By evening, the story had reached national news. CNN's breaking news banner read, "FBI Director's ID burned by airline pilot." Fox News led with, "Shocking discrimination caught on video." The passenger videos had gone viral. Hansen's face was everywhere, along with the moment he burned federal credentials. Legal experts were already appearing on television to discuss the potential federal charges he could face. But perhaps most significantly, other passengers were coming forward. The airline's customer service lines were flooded with calls from people reporting similar incidents with Captain Hansen. Maria Santos called from Phoenix. "That pilot did the same thing to me last month. Asked for extra ID because I looked suspicious in first class." David Kim from Seattle. "Hansen made me show 3 forms of identification and asked how I could afford first class on an immigrant salary." A pattern was emerging, and now the FBI director herself had experienced it firsthand. As Hansen sat in his lawyer's office that evening, one thing was becoming crystal clear. He hadn't just made a mistake. He'd lit a fuse that was about to expose years of systematic discrimination. And Amara Richardson was exactly the right person to make sure justice was served. The full weight of what Captain Derek Hansen had done wouldn't become clear until the following morning, when America woke up to headlines that made the incident impossible to ignore. FBI Director racially profiled, credentials burned by airline pilot. But the real story wasn't just about one bad day on an airplane. The real story was about who Dr. Amara Richardson actually was, and why Hansen had just picked a fight with possibly the worst person in America to discriminate against. At 6 a.m., FBI headquarters released Director Richardson's complete biography to the media. The details painted a picture that made Hansen's assumptions seem not just wrong, but spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Dr. Amara Richardson, 45, had been appointed FBI director 18 months earlier by President Biden, making her only the second black woman to ever hold the position. But her path to that office read like a blueprint for someone destined to confront exactly the kind of discrimination Hansen had displayed. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, Richardson had grown up during the height of the civil rights movement's legacy. Her grandmother had been arrested during the Montgomery bus boycott. Her father had been one of the first black FBI agents in the 1970s, facing discrimination within the Bureau that was only now being fully acknowledged and addressed. Richardson herself had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, where she was the first black woman to serve as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review. She'd spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor, specializing in civil rights cases. Her conviction rate in discrimination cases was 94%. But what made Hansen's actions truly ironic was Richardson's most recent assignment before becoming director. She had spent 3 years leading the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, where she had personally overseen investigations into discrimination in the transportation industry, including airlines. The badge that Hansen had so casually burned wasn't just any federal ID. It was a specially commissioned director's badge, one of only 12 in existence, personally engraved and presented during her swearing-in ceremony. The badge contained security features that took the Treasury Department 6 weeks to create. Destroying it wasn't just illegal. It was a federal crime carrying a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison. But the personal significance went deeper. That badge represented every barrier Richardson had broken, every assumption she'd overcome, every person who had doubted whether a black woman belonged in positions of authority. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin put it best during the morning broadcast. Captain Hansen didn't just burn an ID badge. He literally destroyed the symbol of one of the most powerful law enforcement positions in America, held by someone who has dedicated her career to fighting exactly the kind of discrimination he displayed. The irony was almost Shakespearean in its completeness. Richardson's colleagues at the FBI were stunned, but not entirely surprised. Deputy Director Morrison told reporters, "Director Richardson has always maintained that discrimination isn't just an abstract policy issue for her." Yesterday, she experienced firsthand what millions of Americans face every day. Agent Sarah Collins, who had worked with Richardson for 5 years, added, "What people don't understand about the director is that she's faced this kind of treatment her entire career. The difference is, now she has the authority to do something about it." And that authority was considerable. As FBI director, Richardson oversaw 35,000 employees and a budget of $9.6 billion. She reported directly to the Attorney General and had jurisdiction over federal civil rights violations. Every discrimination case that crossed state lines, every pattern of civil rights violations by major corporations, every federal hate crime investigation, all of it ultimately landed on her desk. More specifically, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, which Richardson had expanded significantly since taking office, maintained active investigations into discrimination patterns in major American industries. The airline industry had been flagged as an area of particular concern, following a surge in passenger complaints. In fact, just 2 weeks before the Hansen incident, Richardson had testified before Congress about exactly this issue, from her congressional testimony now being replayed on every news channel. Discrimination in transportation doesn't just hurt individual passengers. It reinforces systemic inequalities and sends a message about who belongs in American society and who doesn't. When airline personnel make assumptions about passengers based on race, they're not just violating company policy, they're violating federal civil rights law. The congressional hearing had been focused on whether federal authorities needed stronger tools to investigate transportation discrimination. Richardson had argued yes, requesting expanded authority and resources. Now, she had a perfect case study. The burned badge itself was being analyzed by FBI forensics specialists, not for investigative purposes, but for symbolic ones. The charred remains were being preserved as evidence of the discrimination. Crime scene photos showed the melted plastic and metal fragments ground into the airplane carpet. Those fragments represent more than destroyed property, FBI forensics expert Dr. Michael Carter explained to reporters. They represent an attack on federal authority and an attempt to humiliate a law enforcement official based on racial assumptions. But perhaps the most damaging revelation was Richardson's phone call from the morning of the flight. The conversation her assistant had referenced about the briefing tomorrow wasn't just any meeting. Richardson had been scheduled to deliver keynote remarks at the National Civil Rights Enforcement Conference, where she was planning to announce new federal initiatives to combat discrimination in the airline industry. Her prepared remarks, now being leaked to the media, included this passage. "We cannot allow transportation companies to become gatekeepers of American society, deciding who belongs where based on racial prejudice and stereotypes." The speech was titled, "Breaking Down Barriers, Ensuring Equal Access in American Transportation." Hansen had unknowingly targeted the exact person responsible for investigating and prosecuting the kind of behavior he'd displayed. Legal experts were calling it the most ironic civil rights case in decades. Captain Hansen essentially committed a federal crime against the person responsible for prosecuting federal crimes. Harvard law professor Charles Ogletree explained on MSNBC. "It's like robbing the bank where the police chief does her banking while she's standing in line behind you." The badge Hansen burned had been personally presented to Richardson by President Biden during her swearing-in ceremony. The president himself issued a statement. "Director Richardson has my complete confidence and support. The discrimination she experienced yesterday is exactly why we need strong federal civil rights enforcement." As the scope of Richardson's background became clear, Hansen's earlier comments took on an even more damaging tone. His statement that the government doesn't hire people like you for important positions was now being played alongside footage of Richardson being sworn in as head of the nation's premier law enforcement agency. The contrast was devastating. By noon, Meridian Airlines' stock had dropped 12%. Legal experts were predicting federal lawsuits that could cost the company tens of millions of dollars. The airline's board was reportedly holding emergency sessions to discuss Hansen's immediate termination and the company's liability exposure. But for Hansen himself, the personal implications were only beginning to become clear. He hadn't just insulted a passenger. He hadn't just destroyed federal property. He had committed a federal crime against the person with the authority, resources, and personal motivation to ensure he faced the full consequences of his actions. And Director Amara Richardson had a 94% conviction rate. The FBI's investigation into the Hansen incident began at 8:00 a.m. the following morning, exactly 12 hours after the last passenger had disembarked from Flight 447. But this wasn't going to be just another civil rights case buried in bureaucratic paperwork. This was personal for every agent involved. Director Richardson had recused herself from direct involvement, as required by federal guidelines when a law enforcement official is personally involved in an incident. But Deputy Director James Morrison, who took the lead, understood exactly what was at stake. "This isn't about revenge," Morrison told the investigative team during their first briefing. "This is about setting a precedent. If someone can publicly burn the FBI director's credentials and face no consequences, what message does that send about federal authority?" The team assembled for the investigation read like an all-star roster of civil rights enforcement. Agent Patricia Williams, who had successfully prosecuted 3 major airline discrimination cases. Agent Michael Carter, whose specialty was pattern discrimination investigations. Agent Sarah Martinez, fresh off a major victory against a hotel chain that had systematically discriminated against minority guests. They had 48 hours to build an airtight case. The evidence collection began immediately. The burned badge fragments were already in FBI custody, but the team needed more, much more. Agent Williams started with the passenger video footage. Within hours, she had collected 17 different cell phone recordings of the incident, each showing Hansen's actions from multiple angles. The quality was remarkably clear. Hansen's voice saying, "People like you don't belong in first class," was audible on every recording. But it was what happened next that made the legal case ironclad. Agent Carter discovered that Flight 447's cabin audio system had recorded everything. The digital recording captured not just Hansen's discriminatory comments, but also his dismissive statements about federal badges and his deliberate destruction of government property. "You can hear the lighter clicking," Carter reported to Morrison. "You can hear Director Richardson warning him that he's committing a federal crime. And you can hear him laughing and saying he doesn't care because the badges are fake." The evidence was devastating. But the investigation was just getting started. Meanwhile, Meridian Airlines was conducting its own internal investigation, and what they found made their corporate lawyers seriously consider early retirement. Captain Derek Hansen's personnel file revealed a pattern of passenger complaints stretching back over 5 years. The airline's internal complaint database showed 14 separate incidents where passengers had accused Hansen of discriminatory treatment. Maria Santos, October 2023. Captain Hansen questioned my right to be in first class and demanded additional identification. When I provided my American Express Centurion card, he said people like me probably stole it. David Kim, March 2024. Hansen asked me 3 times how I could afford first-class tickets and suggested I might be more comfortable in the back of the plane. Jamal Washington, June 2024. The captain told me I looked suspicious and had security search my carry-on bag twice. Other passengers weren't subjected to any additional screening. Carmen Rodriguez, August 2024. Hansen made comments about immigrants taking seats away from real Americans and questioned whether my travel documents were legitimate. Each complaint had been filed with Meridian's Human Resources Department. Each complaint had been dismissed as a misunderstanding or passenger sensitivity. Hansen had never faced disciplinary action. In fact, he'd received a commendation for maintaining high security standards just 6 months earlier. Meridian's legal team was panicking. The pattern of complaints, combined with the company's failure to address them, created massive liability exposure under federal civil rights laws. "We have documentation proving the airline knew Hansen was engaging in discriminatory behavior and chose to ignore it," FBI agent Williams explained to Morrison. "That's not just negligence. That's willful indifference to civil rights violations." The investigation expanded beyond Hansen to examine Meridian Airlines' corporate policies and training programs. What they found was a systematic failure to address discrimination complaints. Internal emails obtained through federal subpoena painted a damning picture. From Legal Department at meridianair.com. To HR Director at meridianair.com. Subject, passenger complaint. Hansen. Date, March 15th, 2024. Recommend we handle this quietly. The customer is probably just looking for compensation. Hansen's a good pilot. These diversity complaints are getting out of hand. From fleet.manager at meridianair.com to ceo.walsh at meridianair.com. Subject, pilot training costs. Date, July 22nd, 2024. Bias training is expensive and pilots are pushing back. Recommend we focus on safety training only. Customer complaints can be handled case by case. The emails revealed a corporate culture that prioritized protecting employees over addressing discrimination, even when that discrimination was repeatedly documented. But the FBI investigation uncovered something even more damaging. Hansen wasn't the only Meridian pilot with discrimination complaints. A comprehensive review of passenger complaints revealed a pattern across the airline's pilot corps. 43 active pilots had multiple discrimination complaints in their files. The vast majority of complaints came from passengers of color who had been questioned about their right to fly first class. The investigation had uncovered systematic discrimination at one of America's major airlines. 3 days into the investigation, Agent Williams sat down with Hansen for his formal FBI interview. His lawyer, Criminal defense attorney Robert Sterling had advised him to remain silent, but Hansen was desperate to explain himself. "I want to be clear about something," Hansen began, ignoring his lawyer's visible frustration. "I never intended to discriminate against anyone. I was just doing my job." "Your job requires you to burn passengers' federal identification?" Agent Williams asked. "No, that's not. I thought it was fake. She didn't look like someone who would have real government credentials." "What does someone with government credentials look like, Captain Hansen?" The question hung in the air. Hansen's lawyer placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, but Hansen continued. "You know what I mean. Professional, official. She didn't fit the profile." "What profile is that?" "Someone who belongs in first class. Someone who would have a real federal ID." Agent Williams let the silence stretch. Hansen was building the discrimination case against himself with every word. "Captain Hansen, during your 20 years of flying, have you ever questioned the credentials of white passengers in first class?" "That's different." "How is it different?" Hansen's lawyer finally intervened. "My client won't be answering any more questions." But Hansen had already said enough. His own words had confirmed exactly what the evidence suggested. He had targeted Director Richardson because of her race, not because of any legitimate security concern. The investigation's scope continued to expand. The FBI's Civil Rights Division launched a comprehensive review of discrimination complaints across the entire airline industry. What they found was shocking. Industry-wide data showed that passengers of color were 340% more likely to be questioned about their right to fly in premium cabin classes. They were 280% more likely to have their identification scrutinized by flight crews, and they were 450% more likely to be removed from flights for security concerns that were later determined to be unfounded. The Hansen incident wasn't an isolated case of one bad pilot. It was symptomatic of industry-wide discrimination that had been largely ignored by airlines and regulators. FBI Director Richardson, while recused from the investigation, was monitoring the progress closely. The case was becoming exactly what she had hoped for when she took the FBI directorship. A clear example of how federal civil rights enforcement could create real change. During a secure phone call with Deputy Director Morrison, she outlined her vision for the case's broader impact. "James, this investigation needs to be a model for how we handle institutional discrimination. We can't just prosecute Hansen and call it victory. We need to address the systemic issues that allowed this behavior to flourish." "What are you thinking?" "Pattern and practice investigation. Full review of Meridian's policies. Consent decree requiring comprehensive reform. And we use this case to send a message to every airline in America that discrimination will have serious federal consequences." The investigation had grown from a single incident into a comprehensive examination of civil rights in American aviation. Hansen's decision to burn Director Richardson's badge had inadvertently triggered the most thorough federal investigation of airline discrimination in decades. By the end of the first week, the FBI had collected over 300 hours of video evidence, interviewed 47 witnesses, analyzed thousands of internal airline documents, and identified a pattern of discrimination that affected thousands of passengers annually. Hansen's legal team was scrambling to negotiate a plea deal. Meridian Airlines board was discussing a complete leadership overhaul, and the airline industry was bracing for federal oversight that would fundamentally change how they treated passengers. All because one pilot made assumptions about who belonged where and chose the worst possible person to target with those assumptions. The system was finally working exactly as Director Richardson had always envisioned it should. 6 weeks after Captain Derek Hansen burned FBI Director Richardson's credentials, the consequences began to unfold with the precision of federal justice. The courtroom in the Northern District of Georgia was packed beyond capacity. Media representatives filled every available seat, while overflow crowds watched on screens in adjacent rooms. This wasn't just a criminal sentencing. It was a moment of reckoning for an entire industry. Hansen sat at the defendant's table, a shadow of the confident pilot who had strutted through Flight 447's cabin. His 20-year career was over. His pilot's license had been permanently revoked. His pension was gone. His reputation was destroyed. But the personal consequences were just the beginning. Federal Judge Sarah Carter reviewed the case with the gravity it deserved. Captain Hansen, you have pleaded guilty to destruction of federal property, violation of civil rights under federal statute, and interference with a federal officer. These are serious crimes that strike at the heart of equal treatment under law. Hansen's lawyer had negotiated the best deal possible. 18 months in federal prison, 3 years supervised probation, and a $50,000 fine. Hansen would also be required to complete 200 hours of community service with civil rights organizations. But Judge Carter wasn't finished. More troubling than your individual actions, Captain Hansen, is what this case has revealed about systematic discrimination in the airline industry. Your behavior was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that has affected thousands of American travelers. The FBI's investigation had uncovered discrimination complaints against 127 Meridian Airlines employees across 17 states. The pattern was undeniable and damning. As Hansen was led away to begin his sentence, the real consequences were just beginning for Meridian Airlines. CEO Patricia Walsh resigned in disgrace, followed by the entire senior leadership team. The company faced $47 million in federal fines and was required to enter a comprehensive consent decree overseen by the Department of Justice. The consent decree required Meridian to implement mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees every 6 months, fire any employee with substantiated discrimination complaints, install federal monitors in major hubs to observe passenger interactions, pay $15 million into a victim compensation fund, submit to 5 years of federal oversight with surprise compliance audits. But the most significant consequence was the precedent the case established industry-wide. Within weeks, United Airlines voluntarily implemented similar reforms. Delta announced a comprehensive review of its passenger complaint procedures. American Airlines hired a chief diversity officer specifically for customer interactions. The Federal Aviation Administration issued new regulations requiring all airlines to report discrimination complaints to federal authorities within 48 hours. The Department of Transportation announced that civil rights violations would now affect airlines' route allocations and airport access privileges. Director Richardson, speaking at a press conference following Hansen's sentencing, put the broader implications in perspective. This case represents more than justice for one incident of discrimination. It represents a fundamental shift in how our federal government will respond to civil rights violations in transportation. Airlines are public accommodations, and every American has the right to travel with dignity regardless of their race, ethnicity, or appearance. The impact extended beyond airlines. Hotel chains began reviewing their check-in procedures. Rental car companies implemented new anti-discrimination training. The entire travel industry understood that federal civil rights enforcement had entered a new era. For the passengers who witnessed the original incident, the resolution brought a sense of vindication they hadn't expected. Maria Santos, who had filed her own discrimination complaint against Hansen, received a $25,000 settlement from Meridian Airlines. "I never thought anything would come of my complaint," she told reporters. "But seeing Hansen held accountable gives me hope that things are actually changing." David Kim used his settlement to establish a scholarship fund for students studying civil rights law. "If my bad experience on that flight can help train the next generation of civil rights lawyers, then something good came from it." The businessman from Seat 1A, who had witnessed the entire incident, became an unlikely advocate for airline passenger rights. "I've flown first class for 20 years and never noticed the discrimination that passengers of color face. This case opened my eyes to problems I should have seen all along." The flight attendants who witnessed Hansen's behavior were required to undergo additional training, but several voluntarily enrolled in civil rights advocacy programs. Flight attendant Sarah Carter became a vocal advocate for passenger dignity training in the airline industry. Even Hansen's union, initially defensive about the case, eventually acknowledged the need for change. The Allied Pilots Association implemented new ethics training requirements and established a confidential reporting system for pilots to report discriminatory behavior by colleagues. The ripple effects continued for months. Law schools began teaching the Hansen case as an example of effective civil rights enforcement. Business schools used Meridian's failures as a case study in corporate accountability. Most importantly, discrimination complaints on airlines dropped by 68% in the 6 months following Hansen's sentencing. Not because discrimination had disappeared, but because airlines were finally taking complaints seriously and addressing problems before they escalated. Director Richardson had achieved exactly what she'd hoped for: systemic change that protected the rights of all travelers. 1 year later, Director Amara Richardson stood before the National Civil Rights Enforcement Conference, the same conference where she had originally planned to speak the day after Hansen burned her credentials. But now her speech carried the weight of real-world victory. A year ago, I experienced firsthand the discrimination that millions of Americans face when they travel, she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had never wavered, even in that airplane cabin. Today, I can report that our response to that incident has created measurable change across the transportation industry. The statistics were remarkable. Airline discrimination complaints had dropped by 73% nationwide. More importantly, the complaints that were filed were being investigated promptly and resolved fairly. The federal monitoring system had identified and corrected discriminatory practices before they became patterns of abuse. Captain Derek Hansen had served his sentence and was working as a dispatcher for a small logistics company in rural Georgia. As part of his probation requirements, he spoke regularly at diversity training sessions, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unconscious bias. "I thought I was protecting my aircraft and my passengers," Hansen told a recent training session. "But I was really just protecting my own prejudices. I made assumptions about someone based on how they looked, and those assumptions destroyed my career and hurt an innocent person. Don't make the same mistake I did." His presentations were powerful precisely because of their authenticity. Hansen's transformation from perpetrator to advocate wasn't complete. Redemption takes time, but his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes had helped train thousands of airline employees. Meridian Airlines had become an unlikely success story. Under new leadership and federal oversight, the company had transformed its culture so completely that it won the Department of Transportation's Excellence in Customer Service Award just 6 months after the Hansen incident. Their passenger satisfaction scores among minority travelers had improved by 340%. The broader impact continued to unfold. The Hansen case had inspired similar investigations in the restaurant industry, retail chains, and financial services. Federal civil rights enforcement was no longer reactive. It was proactive, using data and pattern recognition to identify discrimination before it became systematic. Director Richardson's burned badge had been replaced, but the original fragments were now on display at the FBI Academy in Quantico, part of a civil rights training exhibit. New agents studied the case as an example of how individual courage and institutional support could create lasting change. "The lesson isn't that discrimination has been eliminated," Richardson concluded her speech. "The lesson is that when we shine light on these problems and respond with appropriate consequences, change is not only possible, it's inevitable." But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Richardson had used her experience to strengthen her resolve and sharpen her focus on civil rights enforcement. The incident that was meant to humiliate her had instead empowered her to create the kind of systematic change she'd always envisioned. The system had worked. Justice had been served. And every American who traveled could do so with a little more dignity because one woman refused to accept discrimination silently. What assumptions do you make about people when you see them in spaces where you think they don't belong? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wondered whether speaking up would make a difference? The Hansen case proves that individual courage, combined with institutional accountability, can create real change. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you to think differently about discrimination and justice, like and subscribe for more stories about courage, accountability, and the ongoing fight for civil rights. Together, we can build a society where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. One story, one stand, one person at a time. Because sometimes, the most powerful response to prejudice is simply refusing to accept it.